Hi, everyone. I'm Anya Parampil, and this is Redlines. My guest today is Francisco Rodriguez. He's the executive director of Oil for Venezuela and also a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome back to Redlines, Francisco.
Thank you, Anya. It's great to be here.
You just released or published a report that you've been working on for quite a while titled Sanctions, Economic Statecraft, and Venezuela's Crisis. It was published and commissioned by the Sanctions and Security Research Project. And you take a look at how U.S. sanctions have impacted economic and social conditions in Venezuela, paying special attention to the country's oil sector. You begin by laying out the economic contraction Venezuela experienced between the years 2012 and 2020, finding that its GDP contracted by about 74% over that 8-year period. You write that, quote, "This is the sixth largest contraction in world history and the largest one in Latin American history since 1950. It is also the second largest contraction in the world outside of war." How did you go about assessing the role U.S. sanctions played in bringing that contraction about?
Okay, well, the first thing that we did is that we started looking at how it is that sanctions affected the Venezuelan economy's capacity to generate foreign currency revenue. So this is an economy that's highly dependent on oil. Oil accounted for 96% of its export revenue. And therefore, we wanted to look very carefully at the effects on the oil industry. And what we found is that when you look at the time series of Venezuelan oil production, it's very clear that whenever there was an intensification of sanctions, whenever there was a key sanctions decision, it would cause a change in the trend of oil production. This didn't just happen once. It happened, we identified in the data 3 times: in August of 2017 with the financial sanctions, then in January of 2019 with the oil sanctions, and in February of 2020 with the secondary oil sanctions. This is the equivalent in terms of time series data of having a person suffer 3 episodes of anaphylactic shock after 3 separate incidents of consuming seafood. So if it happens once, you can still entertain reasonable hypotheses about there being other potential causes. But if it happens 3 times, that's pretty decisive evidence. But we decided to go beyond that and look more carefully at what was happening at specific firms in Venezuela by studying the Orinoco Basin. This is the region where most of the country's oil is produced, and it's a region in which there's an extensive array of joint ventures with multinational companies. So we could look at the effect that financial sanctions had on the firms that had access to finance prior to the sanctions and those that did not have access to finance prior to the sanctions. And what we found, consistent with the hypothesis that sanctions were driving the effect, is that the firms that had access to finance, that therefore that access was closed off by sanctions, suffered disproportionately from the effect of sanctions. So all of this is very strong empirical evidence that sanctions have been a key contributing factor to the decline of Venezuelan foreign currency revenue, which in itself has been the main driver of the country's massive economic contraction.
You mentioned the time series data showing Venezuela's oil production over the years. I wanted to bring that chart up again for viewers. It shows that production was stable up until 2016. That's when global crude prices collapsed altogether. Many countries suffered drops in production during that time. You highlight 3 other inflection points in that graph, which you've mentioned, all correspond with a new measure or a new level of U.S. sanctions targeting Venezuela. And you actually describe this picture as a rare time series equivalent of a smoking gun. How does the comparison to regional oil producers such as Colombia, Mexico, and Argentina help inform that statement that this is actually a smoking gun, showing a relationship between U.S. sanctions and a drop in oil production?
Well, actually, those 3 cases are very interesting because those are cases that are similar in some respects to Venezuela. Colombia and Venezuela are neighbors, but also geologically, a lot of their oil comes essentially from the same region. Mexico and Argentina have had some of the same management issues at the oil industry that have typically been pointed at in the case of Venezuela. They have state-owned firms. They have significant political intervention in the management of oil resources. So these are all cases where we would expect that the behavior might be, no two countries are exactly alike, but that the behavior might be similar to that of Venezuela. And effectively, in those three cases, we find that when oil prices collapse at the beginning of 2016, and just to refresh your memory a bit with that, oil prices had been for several years at around $100 a barrel, and then in mid-2014 they start declining, and then towards the end of 2015 and 2016, really the floor falls from under them, and they fall to below $30 a barrel. That's a moment where a lot of oil producers start struggling. So there we see a decline in Venezuelan oil production that hadn't happened until then. As you point out, it was stable up until January of 2016 occur, but we also see the same decline occur in Colombia, in Argentina, in Mexico. But then what happens is that after August of 2017, which was when the first financial sanctions were imposed in Venezuela, at that moment, oil prices were increasing. They were recovering, and they were going from having been around $30 a barrel, going up to $60, $70 a barrel. That's a moment at which you would have expected oil production to stabilize, because the conditions of these oil producing firms were better. Obviously, if you're selling your product for twice what you were selling it a year ago, then that means that you can have more resources to be able to invest in maintaining your activity. And indeed, that's what we see happen in other countries, but we don't see it happening in Venezuela. In Venezuela, it's the complete opposite. When oil production should have stabilized or recovered, and where oil industry analysts were expecting and projecting that oil production would stabilize or recover, what we see is an acceleration of the drop precisely at the moment at which the first sanctions, those are the August 2017 financial sanctions, were imposed.
And this is when, as you're making these points, critics of Venezuela's government tend to bring up very common talking points, which you actually address in your study. These are talking points that are used generally to obscure the impact of sanctions. And I wanted to give you the chance to respond here for viewers who are watching and listening as well. The first point that people often bring up is that Venezuela's oil sector was underperforming before the 2017 sanctions were imposed.
Yeah. And again, with respect to that particular issue of the oil sector, it's actually not true. The Venezuelan oil sector had stable oil production from the period of for a period of approximately 8 years up until 2016. The decline that we see in 2016 is actually in line with the decline of other actors. Now, what is true is that Venezuela is a country that has severe problems in terms of its public policies, of its management of public resources, and that it could definitely have been using its oil wealth a lot better. So the Chavez administration and then the Maduro administration ran up very high levels of debt. They didn't save enough of the oil boom, and they didn't invest enough in the oil industry. So it's true that Venezuela, having the world's largest oil reserves, even before sanctions, it had a level of production, of oil production, that was less than a third that of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the country that has most reserves after Venezuela, but it still has less reserves than Venezuela. So there are many reasons why we could have expected the country to do better, but that's different from the issue of what actually was the impact of sanctions. The impact of sanctions on an economy that was being managed not well. Yes, the economy was being poorly managed, but it's an economy that its oil sector was not collapsing, and no nobody, and no macroeconomic analyst, no oil sector analyst predicted something even remotely resembling the type of collapse that we saw in the Venezuelan oil sector. It had been an oil sector that had been muddling through during the past 2 decades with all of its management problems. What sanctions served as was essentially as a surgical strike directed at Venezuela's oil sector that caused first the financing, the access to financial markets, and then the access to international trade to completely close off. That's what drove the collapse of the Venezuelan oil sector.
Which brings me to the next argument people will make, which is that there are other factors, including you point to people mentioning the militarization of the oil industry, as well as changes in leadership, high levels of leadership in the oil industry, which contributed to its downfall. I would note that those changes in leadership came as part of an attempt to crack down on mismanagement and corruption within the economy. I think figures in the government would admit that was a serious problem plaguing the sector. And so they actually did make some efforts to remove individuals they viewed or were proven or demonstrated to be acting in a corrupt manner. And some people say that actually is what led to the collapse or the drop in oil production. What do you say to that argument?
Well, this is a typical problem in time series analysis in economics, and we economists don't have experimental data. We don't have perfect data, so we have just the data that emerges out of people's actions. Sometimes it's really difficult to be able to distinguish between different hypotheses and to completely rule out other hypotheses. That's the reason why we focused on the firm level data, because it could allow us to look at firms that were all part of the same industry. So all of these firms are majority owned by PDVSA. The difference is that one of them might be a joint venture with Chevron, the other one might be a joint venture with Total, the other one might be a joint venture with some domestic investors, and some of them had access to finance and some of them didn't have access to finance. So the management changes that affected PDVSA were going to affect all of these firms equally. However, the difference between the firms has to do with the effect that sanctions could have, which was the effect on access to finance. And there again, what we find is that those that did have access to finance were disproportionately hurt. I would also point out, with respect to this hypothesis that it was the management changes that led to the drop in the productivity of the oil sector, we actually have a very interesting case which serves as a direct rebuttal of that, which is that of Citgo, because Citgo is a Venezuelan company. It's part of PDVSA. It's part of the same management. But Citgo's management was directly targeted as a result of those corruption investigations. In fact, this famous and very controversial case about the 6 Citgo board members who are in jail in Venezuela, or who have been in prison in Venezuela, comes because of some corruption allegations leveled against them. So here we have a case in which the government effectively or the prosecutor's office actually took actions that led to the arrest of the majority of the board of this company as a result of the same set of corruption investigations that were being done by the whole government. And if it was true that it was that it was these investigations that led to the collapse, you would have expected Citgo's production to collapse. But Citgo's production didn't collapse. Citgo actually continued doing pretty well during that period. The difference between Citgo and PDVSA and the rest of the Venezuelan oil sector is that Citgo had a license to operate that allowed it to be exempt from U.S. sanctions, because when U.S. officials imposed the sanctions, they didn't want a U.S.-based company like Citgo that was Venezuela owned to experience problems.
Right. And then the final argument people would make in response to everything you're just saying is, well, the sanctions in 2017 didn't really affect Venezuela much because its government was already cut off from international sources of capital. And that in this way the sanctions were just merely redundant. Is that
Yeah.
a fair claim?
Yeah, well, it's also factually wrong. It's factually wrong because what we find is that a great part of the effect of sanctions occurred precisely through affecting these joint ventures in the Orinoco Basin. These joint ventures were joined with oil multinationals. These oil multinationals were the ones that were providing the financing. Typically, the typical scheme would be one in which a joint venture that is, say, 60% owned by the Venezuelan state and 40% owned by a foreign oil company would get a loan from that foreign oil company, which is formally it's another firm, but it would lend to the joint venture so that the joint venture could invest, and then it would be repaid with oil revenues. That type of operations were completely closed down. They were deemed illegal because of the sanctions, and those were the firms that were most hurt. So it's not true that Venezuela did not have access to finance. Even if that argument were true, it's still, if you look at the countries that have lost access to finance, those are countries those are known as distressed debtors. And when you have a distressed debtor and that debtor defaults, so Venezuela defaulted shortly after the sanctions. Let's suppose that default was inevitable. Typically, what happens then is that there's a restructuring. So the company or the government gets together with creditors, tells them, look, we can't pay what we owed you because it's not viable for a firm or for our economy. And they renegotiate a level of debt that is more consistent with the economy's capacity to pay. This is something that Ecuador and Argentina, for example, did recently, and that's what Venezuela would have done at that moment. It could have been in 2017, it could have been in 2018, but at some moment over the course of the past few years, it would have done it, even if it had defaulted in the absence of sanctions. What sanctions did was that they impeded Venezuela from restructuring its debt. So it turned what would have been at most a temporary closing off of capital markets into a permanent closing off of capital markets. I should also point out that behind all of these arguments, there's always this broader argument of saying, well, the crisis began before the sanctions, so sanctions couldn't be the cause of the crisis, and that's a very weak argument. And it's an argument that it really doesn't pass basic academic and rigorous scrutiny, because the reality is that there were factors contributing to negative economic growth in Venezuela before the sanctions, and we have the effect of the sanctions that comes after the sanctions. There's no reason why any phenomena, including an economy's contraction, can't be driven by more than one factor. So it could be mismanagement of the Maduro regime and sanctions that caused the country's economic contraction, and the evidence shows that that was the case. What sometimes happens with these arguments is that they're used rhetorically as a device, a lot of times to confuse public debate. So when they tell you, oh, it's not sanctions and it was Maduro that caused the country's economic contraction, and the research that tries to establish rigorously the effect of sanctions is just trying to exculpate Maduro, they are essentially using what's known as argument. They're setting up this straw man in which those of us who've done research on sanctions are characterized as saying that Maduro's policies had no effect. But nobody has really seriously said that. Everybody recognizes, or at least all of the rigorous research that's been done here recognizes that there were serious flaws in the economic policies of the Chavez administration, of the Maduro administrations, that those contributed negatively to economic growth. The argument that's being made here has to do concretely with identifying the effect of sanctions. That effect of sanctions is significant, it's sizable, and it has had enormous repercussions for the well-being of Venezuelans.
Yeah, which is when we look specifically at the analysis you've mentioned, comparing firms which had access to external capital and those which didn't following at the time of the 2017 financial sanctions, that in looking at that data, you actually determined, though, that without sanctions, Venezuela's oil production would have recovered with the recovery in global oil prices. How were you able to definitively make that claim?
Well, a lot of empirical analysis is based on trying to obtain estimates of the effects of interventions. And this is an intervention just as any other intervention is. So it is a policy action that is directed at a certain sector, at Venezuela's oil sector, and that specifically affects some firms here, which are the firms that had access to finance first before the sanctions. So what we do when we produce those estimates is that first, we use the data to quantify what was the effect on the production of these firms of losing access to finance, and then we use those estimates to extend to the whole oil sector in a scenario in which, in a counterfactual scenario in which there had been no sanctions. And here what's really interesting is that the exercise actually produces several sets of estimates, and this happens, of course, a lot, and it's a feature of a lot of empirical research that you can, when you're trying to map out a scenario of what could have happened, say in the absence of sanctions, you have to define really carefully what that counterfactual scenario that you're trying to map out really looks like, and what it is that you're trying to represent. So there is a lower bound estimate, which is one in which we effectively what we identify is, look, these firms that lost access to capital markets would have maintained it, and therefore would have maintained growth in their production at that level. And that estimate, that's an estimate in which what we find is that approximately half of the decline of production in those firms is effectively attributed to sanctions. But then there's another estimate, which I also think is a reasonable one, which is one in which we say, well, what would probably have happened in the absence of sanctions is that these mechanisms through which these firms had access to finance, which were these loans from their foreign partners, would have been implemented more strongly by the government, because this had become a pretty successful mechanism, which was implemented between 2013 and 2017. And what we were seeing was that this mechanism was being extended to new firms. So probably in the absence of sanctions, what would have happened is that more firms would have started using this mechanism that would allow them to have access to finance, and therefore you would have seen stronger production growth. And this kind of gets at more at that general point of, yes, Venezuela had a debt problem in 2017, but there are ways in which countries deal with debt problems. And generally they restructure their debts. One of the ways in which they can do it is that they can look for foreign partners that are interested in investing in a country and allow them to take care of the debt problem through offering investment opportunities. Venezuela was doing this and would probably have continued doing it in the absence of sanctions. And in that case, it would have experienced probably a robust production growth in the absence of sanctions.
At this point, I think it's useful to understand the sanctions which were imposed in 2017 and 2019 specifically. In 2017, the Trump administration issued sanctions barring entities from issuing new debt to Venezuela. And this is what you're saying prevents this ability on behalf of Venezuela to sit down and restructure its debt, because it was no longer, or foreign entities were now in a position where they risk being sanctioned by the United States for merely engaging in that kind of negotiation with Venezuela. And so can you explain the 2017 sanctions and then also the 2019 sanctions and how those directly targeted the oil industry?
Sure. So in 2017, the US government essentially said, nobody in the US can lend to Venezuela. Nobody can lend to Venezuela. Nobody can lend to PDVSA, the state-owned Venezuelan oil company. and neither Venezuela nor PDVSA can collect dividends on its offshore assets, such as, for example, Citgo. This also meant, by the way, that it couldn't access approximately $7 billion of cash holdings, which were the dividends that had been accumulated by these joint venture companies. What's really important to understand is that almost the totality of PDVSA financial operations at that time, as well as that of most oil companies, is done under U.S. law. It's done in U.S. financial markets. So when PDVSA is going to borrow money from somebody, from some international firm, or from a bank where it's going to issue bonds, or where it's going to refinance some bonds, that is done in New York in a legal sense. And what that means is that Venezuela, and that occurs because investors are comfortable with New York law, and New York law offers a set of protections. So when the United States said, U.S. persons cannot lend to Venezuela, that didn't just affect U.S. firms. It affected every single firm that would have lent to it using U.S. markets. And it also affected international capital markets, which if Venezuela had wanted to refinance, restructure its debt, it would have done so by exchanging bonds which had been issued in New York according to New York law for other bonds issued in that jurisdiction. Neither of those was possible. It became barred from a legal standpoint. And also when the U.S. sends this signal, even European investors who maybe, if this was just a legal problem, would have tried to find ways around it, they received a very strong signal from the U.S. essentially saying, we don't want you to do this. And at the same time, 1 month after the sanctions, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a division of the U.S. government, issued a directive that cautioned compliance officers in all financial institutions to essentially treat Venezuelan transactions as the product of money laundering. Something that we document in the study is how this type of directives are issued, or were issued during the Trump administration, related only to cases in which the Trump administration had a foreign policy goal. It wasn't something directed generally at jurisdictions where there were problems with financial crimes. They were targeted at countries like Venezuela. So all of this had this huge toxification effect on the economy, where nobody wanted to be involved with transactions that the U.S. administration was saying this is something that we view very negatively. That gets us to 2019, where given that these initial sanctions, even though that they had a strong effect on Venezuela's oil sector and the Venezuelan economy, had not been able to achieve the U.S. foreign policy goals, and the U.S. And the Trump administration effectively decides to take one step further and decides to bar any type of oil trade between Venezuela and the United States. So that meant that Venezuela couldn't access its main export destination at the moment of the sanctions, which was the U.S. It also meant that Venezuela and the Venezuelan government could not buy inputs for its oil sector from the U.S., which it had been getting up until that moment. And at that moment, when they do it, the Trump administration also starts sending very strong signals that they would be willing to impose secondary sanctions, what are known as secondary sanctions, on non-U.S. actors that do business with Venezuela. And it's essential to understand this. The U.S. just has jurisdiction over U.S. firms, but what the U.S. can do is that it can say that a non-U.S. firm, say a Spanish or an Indian firm, is quote unquote materially assisting the Maduro government. And therefore, it can decide to sanction that firm that is materially assisting the Maduro government. That is to impede U.S. persons from having interactions with that firm. And doing that effectively means that the firm's bank's accounts will be closed or will be frozen in the U.S., and that no U.S. financial institution will want to do business with them. That's what the U.S. did with Rosneft, a Russian firm that in as of February 2020, it was helping sell 75% of Venezuelan oil to non-US markets, to markets where the US has no jurisdiction. Rosneft wasn't violating sanctions because the US cannot legally restrict what a Russian firm is doing with Venezuela, as long as it doesn't touch the U.S. markets. But what the U.S. did in 2020 was that it decided to sanction Rosneft for helping Venezuela. So it therefore impeded U.S. Economic actors from doing any business with Rosneft. This was extremely damaging to Rosneft. And for that reason, Rosneft almost immediately pulled out of Venezuela. And that's when the third collapse in Venezuelan oil production happens, when it effectively loses access to all of its markets.
And this gets at something else you introduced fairly early on in your study, which is you kind of argue that sanctions as a term is insufficient. That's an insufficient way of looking at U.S. policy toward Venezuela. You introduced the concept of Venezuela targeted actions of economic statecraft. What does this term mean?
Well, economic statecraft is a term that is used in the foreign policy literature to refer to kind of a broader array of actions that governments take in order to use the economy, to use economic power to influence the actions of other countries. And effectively, what we have seen is that there are some actions that are taken by the US government, which formally you wouldn't consider them sanctions, but they have the same effect. So I just mentioned one of them, the FinCEN directive. So the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network says, don't touch transactions from Venezuela. And it says that to all compliance officers. That has an effect on the Venezuelan economy. It has an effect on its financial entities. However, it's not formally a sanction. It's formally another mechanism, but it does have economic effects. Or perhaps the most important one, which is the recognition of a government that has no de facto control over its territory, the interim government of Juan Guaido. What the US does in January of 2019 is that it transfers, when it recognizes Guaido, it transfers control over US bank accounts of the Venezuelan government, of the central bank, and therefore by implication also of the Venezuelan state-owned oil company to the Guaido administration. So this isn't a sanction. It's not formally from a legal standpoint a sanctions measure. It is a recognition decision. The US can say, this is simply a foreign policy decision. We decided to recognize Guaido. But what you're doing is that you're impeding the government that runs a country from having access to the resources that it needs to use in order to deal with that country's economic problems. And in so doing, it has the same effects, if not even more powerful effects than those of the oil sanctions.
Yeah, and you make the point in the study that due to the recognition of Guaido, even if tomorrow the United States were to lift the oil sanctions and the financial sanctions, Venezuela still would not be able to trade its oil with the United States because the government, the US recognizes Guaido's government doesn't actually have the capacity to trade the oil.
Exactly, that's correct. If the Maduro government were to say, in the event of lifting of sanctions, put Venezuelan oil on a tanker and send it to the US. Once it got to the US, the first thing that Guaido's attorney general would do would be to ask for those funds, for the funds derived from the sale of that oil, to be transferred to accounts controlled by the Guaido administration. So unless there's an agreement between Maduro and Guaido to manage these resources jointly, there's no way in which they can access the oil markets or the financial markets or any markets for that matter, the Venezuelan state at least of the US. And this affects other countries also. This is exactly what's going on in the Bank of England. There's money of the Venezuelan central bank, and the central bank that could actually use those funds in order to be able to transfer them to the government for attending Venezuela's humanitarian situation. And that's the government that has control over the territory. The Maduro government does not have access to them because there is a legal process in which British courts have not yet decided which of Venezuela's two governments should be allowed to handle those resources. But this is all a byproduct, not of a sanctions decision. The UK has not imposed economic sanctions in Venezuela. The US has, but not the UK. But the UK has recognized the Guaido administration and therefore, as a result, frozen $2 billion of Venezuelan assets.
Something else interesting in your study is the fact that you previously analyzed Venezuela's oil production by comparing it with other oil producing countries, 36 countries actually. And looking at the chart, viewers can see that Venezuela was on track with its peers up until the fall of 2017, when it experienced a steep drop off. You write that, quote, the only country that suffered a change in trend similar to Venezuela at that period was Yemen, whose oil fields were the target of a Saudi bombing campaign at the time. Put differently, the collapse in Venezuela's oil production is of a dimension that we only see when armies blow up oil fields. That's a pretty shocking quote, which is why I wanted to highlight it, Francisco. What more can you tell me about that comparison?
Well, effectively, what we did, and this actually comes out from an original discussion with other economists when we first highlighted that if you compare Venezuela, say, with Colombia, you had the same trend in production in oil production up until the moment of the sanctions. At the moment of the sanctions, they start to diverge, with Colombia's stabilizing and Venezuela's declining. And then we looked at Argentina, we looked at Mexico, and with any comparison that you can make, there skeptics can always point out, well, maybe those two countries are not the best ones to compare. So what we did is that we created a panel of oil producers, and we essentially compared it to every single other oil producer on which there's data. And we found exactly the result that you cite, that the only country that Venezuela looked like post-sanctions was Yemen, which was a country in which there was a war and oil fields were literally being bombed. And this resembles what's happening in the broader data. Venezuela has the largest contraction in Latin American economic history, the second largest peacetime contraction in world economic history, or at least since we have comparable data, which is 1950. So what the data is telling you is Venezuela looks like a wartime economy. So what we're seeing, the type of economic destruction that we're seeing in Venezuela is what you see as a product of destructive conflict, armed conflict between groups that are fighting for power, and this also is something that should lead us to reflect about all of the hypotheses that point just to mismanagement of oil resources by the Maduro administration, which again I believe is important. I believe that the Maduro administration has mismanaged the economy significantly. But Maduro's policies, and I've been a critic of Maduro's policies for a very long time, but Maduro's policies aren't that different from that of other countries and other governments that also mismanage their economies. And when we look at those cases, such as, for example, that of Peru during the first government of Alan Garcia, or that of Nicaragua during the first administration of the Sandinistas, we find, and that was a case actually in which there was a significant armed insurgency, but still in those cases, we find contractions of 20, 30% of GDP, not of 70% of GDP. So Venezuela is a country where everything that we're seeing, both at the level of the collapse of its oil sector, the collapse of its economy, the migration exodus, 6 million persons leaving the country, all of this is the type of economic reaction that we see to a wartime economy. And I believe that is a consequence of the fact that some of the policies that are being taken by key actors in the international community, particularly the United States, are targeting the Venezuelan economy in the same way in which in some armed conflicts, actors target economic installations. That's what's generated this vast destruction that manifests itself in an economy that has the characteristics and the symptoms of an economy that has undergone a war.
And that's why you also compare or look at data regarding oil production in Iran, Iraq, and Libya, countries which have also been either the direct target of a similar sanctions regime, such as in Iran, or the direct target of war in the case of Iraq and Libya. And you found that oil production corresponded with sanctions in a similar way to Venezuela, correct? Where they were actually, their oil production suffers when they're under sanctions, but they're able to recuperate once those sanctions are lifted.
That's correct. So when we try to investigate the effect of a particular intervention in one person or in one object of study, from a purely scientific viewpoint, it's actually difficult to try to do this because there are many things that can be happening with one person or with one country. So typically the way in which we try to look at issues such as the effect of sanctions or the effect of any intervention, or the effect of vaccines for that matter, is that we look at populations and we see what the average effect of an intervention is on a population. So what we've done with this data is also to study the effect that similar sanctions have had on economies with the similar structures. So because say that Venezuela's oil production had contracted with sanctions, but that if we looked at Iraq, at Iran, and Libya, we had seen sanctions on oil producers, but those economies had performed well, then you would conclude, well, maybe it's not sanctions in Venezuela. But if you find that the same policy intervention, the same or very similar sanctions measures have similar effects on different countries, then that increases your confidence that in any particular case, sanctions is a driving factor. And indeed, that is also what we find. We find that in cases such as those of Iraq, Iran, Libya, sanctions aimed at the oil sector of countries that are highly dependent on the oil revenues, so countries where oil generates most of the foreign currency revenue, have a very significant effect on these countries' economies.
And so this led you to estimate that these sanctions actually have cost Venezuela somewhere between 11.4 and $12.3 billion annually?
Yes, there are, as we've been describing in this interview, there are many different ways in which you can estimate the effect of sanctions. So we can, and again, we could draw a parallel to other policy interventions. So right now, there are many people who are trying to estimate the effect of vaccines and the effects of different public policies to handle the COVID crisis. There are different methodologies to do it. There are different samples on which they're studied, and those samples can give rise to different magnitudes of the estimates. So we've done that both with the Venezuelan time series data, with the time series cross-section panel data of oil producers, and we've also done that with the Venezuelan firm level data. All of these produce different estimates, but generally these estimates fall in a range that explains between 50% to 100% of the decline in Venezuela's oil production after 2017. Depending on what oil prices you're estimating this at, these effects can be sizable, but they can be on the range of between 10, 15 billion to up to $30 billion in net effects on the country's capacity to generate foreign revenue.
The US and EU claim that they implement smart sanctions, which don't impact any humanitarian efforts within a country that they are targeting. Is there such thing as smart sanctions?
Well, the US and the EU have different policies. The EU policies, I think, have a better claim at being smart sanctions because they are effectively aimed at government officials. They are individual sanctions aimed at members of the government that the EU has determined have contributed either through violations of human rights or of corruption. That's in the case of the EU, sorry. In the case of the US, you also have economic sanctions, such as the financial sanctions that we've been discussing, such as the sanctions aimed at Venezuela's oil industry. And those are sanctions that the European Union has very strongly asserted that it will not consider because of the harm that they could generate to the Venezuelan population. Not only the European Union, the US is the only country that has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela. I mean, most countries generally recognize as a matter of their foreign policy that they are not going to be involved in policies that target the Venezuelan population. So the US is an outlier on this issue, which is the direct targeting of civilians in a political conflict. With very significant effects on the country's humanitarian situation. So the US sanctions are definitely not smart in that sense. In those of Europe, I think that they have a better claim. You can still, of course, claim that there are that there are effects, even of the sanctions that are in principle designed to be smart sanctions. And just to explain a bit to viewers, when you talk about smart sanctions, they're supposed to be these sanctions that are aimed just at individuals or at specific actors that are linked to the regime. But of course, you can generate, even those smart sanctions can generate a huge overcompliance problem at the level of financial institutions. Because financial institutions can say, well, how do I know when I'm processing a transaction from a Venezuelan or from an Iranian or from a Syrian entity that these are not frontmen from the regime? And sooner or later, it might happen that some information comes to light that shows that they are, and the firm might be the subject not only of enforcement actions, but also of a whole set of public relations issues that come together with it. So what has ended up happening is that many financial institutions have decided to severely cut down or eliminate transactions with actors that are associated even just with these countries, so that you have wholesale closing off of the accounts of Venezuelan persons who have nothing to do with the Maduro regime. And I'll give you a concrete example. Very recently, a Venezuelan opposition legislator, former legislator, who had been one of the staunchest defenders of the Maduro regime, of the Guaido government. So one of the staunchest opponents of the Maduro regime. He had severe health problems, and he was undergoing economic trouble. So his family put together a GoFundMe campaign in order to collect money to help his health treatment. And GoFundMe identified this opposition former legislator as a politically exposed figure linked to Venezuela, and therefore it actually gave back all the contributions. So people weren't able to assist this person with dealing with his very severe problems related to cancer. This is the type of, it happens all the time to Venezuelans, and it's one way in which even those sanctions, which are supposed to design to be smart, have an effect on the lives and conditions of all Venezuelans.
Yeah, and you document many other instances in your study, including the prevention of cancer treatment for children that came about as a result of the closing of accounts just on a whim, and basically out of fear in this overcompliance that you describe. Institutions thinking that any Venezuelan with an account can be a red flag, something that causes then the US government to retaliate against them. Francisco, we've talked a lot about the problems facing Venezuela as a result of these sanctioned policies, but you also put forward some solutions in your study. How would you describe the way forward that you think best fits Venezuela at this time for viewers?
Well, I think first we have to understand again that there's an issue which involves sanctions, but it also involves the decision by the US and some international actors to recognize the government, the Guaido government, that does not have de facto control over the country. So this is a result of the country's political conflict, and this has to be handled. It has to be dealt with in a way that helps insulate Venezuelans from the fallout of this political conflict. The simplest way to do it is to get these two sides to agree, to get Guaido and Maduro to sit down, aside from their political differences, and set up a mechanism and for the international community to support that mechanism, whereby the country can start accessing its funds again and its capacity to generate revenue. So you could have, and you should have, a humanitarian oil agreement between the parts of Venezuela's political conflict, and the US should agree to lift or create exemptions for oil sanctions as long as the funds are handled within the context of this agreement between the parts. And that means, and that agreement could and should be designed so that there is international supervision over the use of those funds to ensure that these funds are used to address the needs, the urgent needs of Venezuelans. More broadly, this can be applied to the access of the country to its funds deposited in banks and international banks. We talked about the Bank of England case. We talked about access to oil markets. There's also the International Monetary Fund, where there are $5 billion in Venezuelan special drawing rights, which Venezuela has not been able to draw on because the IMF, whose decisions essentially reflect those of its member countries, and where the US is very influential, has not been able to reach a decision on which government to recognize. So there has to be a support for a framework of humanitarian agreements that allow the use of Venezuela's funds to solve and to address the needs of this dramatic humanitarian crisis that the country is undergoing. At the same time, there are very specific reforms to the sanctions regimes that can be done by, first of all, economic sanctions should be phased out completely. The sanctions that target the whole Venezuelan economy, that target the oil sector, that target its access to finance, those, as I already mentioned, the US is the only country that adopts them. They are targeted at Venezuelans. They're not targeted at the government. They are the modern equivalent of siege warfare, and they should have no place in the foreign policy of a civilized nation. So those should be eliminated. There should still be a place for personal sanctions in the policies of the US and Europe and many of other countries that have decided to hold them. But measures should be taken to ensure that those do not affect the broader populations of these countries. And there, entities such as the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control can do a lot in order to reduce those incentives for overcompliance. For example, they could pre-clear humanitarian agencies and issue a list of humanitarian agencies doing work in Venezuela that financial entities know that they can process transactions from those agencies. There's very simple work that can be done if there is actually the willingness to address the humanitarian situation. The problem is that at the level of US foreign policy, at times this willingness doesn't really exist. It's more like the aim of sanctions has been to worsen Venezuelan conditions to try to see if that produces regime change. And that's where this policy is not only misguided, it is really essentially it's cruel and it's inhuman, and it is contrary to international law.
And I suppose the Venezuelan government would say that the recognition of Guaido is a violation of international law, as are these unilateral coercive measures, these sanctions, which, as you say, only the US implements. Why is that something that's permitted? I guess it's just because the US has outsized control of the financial system, and so it can pressure countries into bending to its will. But that's why Iran, Venezuela, and these other countries are working together to actually build a system outside of that financial structure. That's a conversation for another day. But again, thank you so much, Francisco, for this study. It's really thorough. I'm going to include charts and tables that you put in this interview so that viewers can see it for themselves. And where can they find this study for anyone who's interested in looking at it? And where can they see more of your work?
Well, the study is in the Sanctions and Security Research Project webpage. It's also published by the Fourth Freedom Forum, and they can also access it at the webpage of Oil for Venezuela, oilforvenezuela.org, as well as my personal webpage, franciscorodriguez.net.
All right. Thanks so much, Francisco.
Okay, thank you very much, Anya.